Africa is the poorest continent in the world, and it's only getting worse. Of the world's 26 low-income countries, 23 are in sub-Saharan Africa. For decades, the Western world has been trying, if not a little half-heartedly, to help the continent out of poverty. In the early 1960s, billions were poured into infrastructure programs. In the 80s, it was mass vaccinations, and in the 90s, they wrote off all of their debt. Yet none of this has seemed to work. All sorts of reasons have been given for this failure, from corruption to colonial legacies to bad governance. But what if the actual reason was a lot simpler? Since gaining independence, Africa has been the most internally fragmented continent in the world. Just 16% of the continent's trade stays within the region, nearly 4 times less than in Asia or Europe. Instead, most goods are sold to countries like the US and China, markets so large that individual African nations have almost no negotiating power, ending up stuck in deals where they sell their natural resources, diamonds, gold, and oil, for literal pennies on the dollar. So what if the 55 African countries were to unify as one? Overnight, a patchwork of disconnected economies would turn into one of the largest markets on Earth, transforming Africa into a global power, able to compete with China, the US, and Europe. But while unification sounds like an obvious solution, there are powerful interests that benefit from keeping Africa divided, even if it means keeping the continent trapped in poverty for generations. This is the story of how Africa was broken, and why it's remained that way ever since. For most countries, borders evolved over thousands of years, gradually coming to represent dividing lines between ethnic groups, cultures, and political institutions. But in Africa, the opposite is true. In the late 19th century, during the scramble for Africa, European powers carved the entire continent up in a matter of decades, dividing territory among themselves in European conference rooms. Borders cut across rivers, trade routes, and communities, splitting some societies apart, while forcing others into the same box. Ethnicities like the Somali people ended up being split across 4 countries, despite sharing a language and culture for 100 years. So when the region gained independence, it didn't emerge as a single country, but as Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. That meant huge Somali communities suddenly found themselves ruled by governments dominated by entirely different ethnic groups, creating deep resentment toward the states that now controlled them. By 1964, an all-out war had erupted between Ethiopia and Somalia, effectively fighting over the control of the Somali-inhabited Ogaden region. Far from being a one-off, these kind of regional conflicts came to define the area. Nigeria descended into civil war over Biafra. Sudan split after decades of north-south conflict, and the Congo collapsed into chaos almost immediately. Since 1945, roughly a third of the wars in the world have taken place in Africa. Of course, because there was so much fighting going on across the continent, large-scale regional trade became almost impossible. So in the decades following independence, intra-African trade collapsed to less than 10% of total, 6 times less than in Europe, Asia, and North America. That left newly independent states with practically only one viable option to fall back on: exporting raw materials directly to large industrial economies. But the thing is, for most African countries, competing in this world was practically impossible. Imagine that you were a farm trying to negotiate a better deal to sell eggs to the local supermarket. If you ask for too high a price, the shop will just go to a different farmer, offering more or less the same product. Now imagine that you are Coca-Cola. Basically, whatever price you negotiate with the supermarket, they have to accept it, because they can't buy the same product from anywhere else. The same thing happens when countries try to trade with one another. Small countries that produce goods anyone else can copy end up getting far worse deals than large, powerful countries that produce things nobody else can. And by the 1970s, that's exactly the situation Africa found itself in. The countries that dominated the global economy were operating on a scale of entire continents. The United States, a 50-state single market alone, accounted for about 40% of global GDP. Europe was close behind, accounting for almost 25%. On the flip side, more than half of African countries had populations under 10 million. Most had no meaningful manufacturing base, and tiny domestic markets and export profiles dominated by a single commodity. And because each of these relatively small countries operated alone, they had almost no leverage. Ghana, for example, sold cocoa almost entirely through long-term contracts priced in London, and when it attempted to push prices higher in the early 1960s, buyers simply shifted purchases to Nigeria and the Ivory Coast. Kenya faced the same problem with coffee, where prices were set by international commodity exchanges denominated by European and American buyers, leaving producers as price takers rather than negotiators. This inevitably meant that when one country tried to demand better terms, buyers could simply turn to another African supplier offering the same product. Instead of creating better outcomes for the continent as a whole, individual nations were set against each other. Because of this, the profits that could have funded growth were captured overseas, leaving domestic businesses without enough cash to make long-term investments. Even decades after being granted independence, African countries continue to fall behind the rest of the world, despite being home to some of the most resource-rich land in the world. Now, the concept of collective bargaining isn't exactly new. So as early as the 1960s, it was clear that the lack of unity was costing the continent a huge amount, and for a brief while, there was something of a movement to fix it. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. Until not too long ago, I was doing most of the work on these videos by myself, but thanks to your support, we now have a full team of researchers working round the clock to make these videos possible. If you're a business owner, you know exactly all the things that come with it, but everything that you can dream of one day needing is on Odoo. It's an all-in-one business management platform offering over 45 apps to help you manage your business, but the one I want to highlight today is their invoicing app. With Odoo, you can create and send invoices in seconds. Just select your customer, add your products or service, set quantities, set the billing terms, and send it directly by email, all from one place. And let clients pay online through the customer portal using their preferred payment method like Stripe, PayPal, or other methods. And if you connect your bank, Odoo automatically updates in real time the payment status, so you always know what's been paid and what's still pending. With Odoo's first app free for life plan, you can start using Odoo's invoicing app completely for free, including unlimited hosting and support. Try it today using the link in the pinned comment or description. In 1963, Ghana's first leader, Kwame Nkrumah, stood in Addis Ababa and warned African states to unite now or perish. That same month, 32 newly independent states signed the charter that created the Organization of African Unity. To many, this was the turning point. But there was a major issue. Because most early African governments were so fragile, if as a leader you got on stage and acted like you were willing to give away your power to a pan-national bloc, it was almost a surefire way to get kicked out of office. In fact, the very architect of African unity learned this firsthand as he pushed for continental unity early in Ghana's independence and was quickly accused of prioritizing pan-African ideals over Ghana's economy. His critics argued that instead of unity, Ghana should protect its borders, secure its own income, and fix domestic shortages first, rather than tying its fate to neighbours whose economies were just as fragile. A message which, even today, is still coming back into fashion across the world. By 1966, just 3 years after the Organisation of African Unity was formed, Nkrumah was overthrown in a military coup while he was abroad. While unity might have been what was required to help get the continent back on the path to development, politically, it was practically impossible. A big part of the reason for that is simply that nobody's ever agreed on what unified Africa would actually look like. It's often imagined as one flag, one president, and one government. But most of the economic success stories built on unity never started that way. They started by building markets. The European Union is a good example. It didn't make Europe one country. Instead, it spent decades doing the unglamorous work of integration, removing the frictions that actually stop firms growing. Things like border checks, mismatched product standards, and payment rules, so a manufacturer in Italy could actually sell in France or Germany without redesigning its product or renegotiating contracts every time it crossed the border. This is what turned dozens of national economies into something that functioned like one large market. For Africa, unity would mean turning 55 separate markets into a system big enough for firms to grow inside, where goods, money, and people can move without every border being a hassle. Without that, countries end up stuck trying to grow firms inside markets that barely exist, a problem which in Africa's case is particularly detrimental. Most African countries have populations the size of a European country, but because it's such a poor continent, the consumer base simply isn't big enough to support large-scale production. Rwanda is a great example of this. The country has made real progress over the past 2 decades, with improving governance, rising incomes, and a reputation for being business-friendly. But as a market, it is still tiny. Rwanda has around 13 million people, most of whom have limited purchasing power, and it sits hundreds of miles away from the nearest major port. That means that firms within the country have very little opportunity to scale domestically, and at the same time, trading with African countries is still insanely expensive. To see how this works, take this example. Shipping a standard container from Mombasa to Rotterdam or Shanghai will cost around $1,000 and takes roughly 30 days, while moving that very same container just 1,200 kilometers inland to Kigali can cost up to $4,000 and will likely take around 40 days because of congestion and delays. The World Bank currently estimates that transport costs within Africa are 50 to 75% higher than in other developing nations. A lot of this comes from how fragmented the continent is. Instead of one large economic system, which is designed to plan infrastructure at scale, you have more than 50 separate governments, each building roads, railways, power grids, and ports to serve their own borders. Transport networks often end up stopping at national frontiers, even when the next major city, port, or market is just a few kilometers across the border. And even if firms are able to transport goods across the country's crumbling transport networks, chances are the second they make it to a border, they will be stopped. Because different countries use different regulatory rules, trucks have to be re-inspected every time they cross a line on a map. On top of that, average tariff rates across the continent sit at around 10%, which might not sound like a lot, but it puts African firms at a massive disadvantage compared to other major economic blocs like the EU, US, or China, where internal trade is effectively tariff-free. Of course, small traders can, and often do, work around these barriers, rerouting goods informally or paying bribes. That might work if you're moving a few bags of grain or consumer goods in the back of a truck, but it becomes far harder for companies trying to run multi-million-dollar operations. Even if they try to bribe their way through every checkpoint and delay, the cost would quickly spiral out of control, bringing them back to square one and making it cheaper and more reliable to trade with foreign markets instead. But it's exactly those larger scale firms that the continent desperately needs to help it industrialize. Companies capable of investing in machinery, training workers, and even building the infrastructure the continent is so critically lacking. Today, roughly 85% of all employment in sub-Saharan Africa sits outside the formal economy. As a result, manufacturing makes up only about 10% of Africa's economy, a number that hasn't really improved for a long time. That's why Africa can feel paradoxical from the outside. People see poverty and assume labor must be cheap, but for many businesses, producing in Africa is actually expensive relative to what they produce. One of the strangest examples of this is in the energy market. A factory in Nigeria or Kenya will often run diesel generators for hours a day, even while sitting a few hundred miles away from a hydro dam or gas plant in a neighbouring country, simply because the grids are not connected in a way that makes cross-border power trade routine. That means instead of plugging into a large, cheaper power source nearby, firms are forced to make their own electricity on site, burning expensive fuel every day for something that should be basic or shared. Due to this, many African countries end up importing power through diesel generators, fuel contracts, spare parts, and maintenance services, which are often sourced from Europe or Asia, even though the raw material exists closer to home. A unified market would help fix this, stopping borders from crossing cross-border grids and allowing countries to draw on each other's generation the same way regions do inside a single state. All of this points to the same underlying problems. Africa isn't short of resources or labour, but a market large enough and open enough for the continent to actually trade with itself and keep some of what it makes. And to be fair, the continent has made some positive steps towards this. In 2018, the African Continental Free Trade Area was founded, which aimed to unify Africa under effectively a single market. The agreement officially came into force in 2021, with 54 of 55 countries signed up. Under the agreement, 90% of goods which have tariffs will be eliminated over a period of 5 to 10 years, with the longer-run target of free access for at least 97% of goods. But what has happened since the agreement is telling. Trade under the agreement has technically begun, but remains limited to a small number of pilot shipments and a narrow group of firms. In fact, in 33 African countries, trade within the continent has actually declined since the agreement was signed, with intra-African trade still accounting for less than 15% of the continent's total figure. In many countries, customs officers still rely on national tariff schedules, rules of origin are unevenly applied, and the systems that are supposed to make AfCFTA work have been more slow to take hold. In theory, the agreement exists, but as is often the case, actually getting people to do what they're agreed is a lot harder. A genuinely united Africa could change the continent's growth path forever. It could let firms grow larger, raise productivity, and push wages higher, not through aid or charity, but because businesses finally have room to scale. But that only happens if unity means cutting the hidden costs that keep African economies trading outwards instead of inside with each other. So the real question isn't whether Africa should become one country, it's whether it can become one economy in practice, and whether the people who benefit from it are willing to let it happen.